according to contemporary critical scholars, the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament, were actually written by 4 major different authors way later than the events actually took place. And in fact, they don't really believe that the vast majority of the events in the Pentateuch did take place. But they were anyways written by these authors, and they all had their own different contradictory theologies, beliefs, emphases, and desires to propagate one idea or another. Eventually, these were all put together by some great, fabulous, and ingenious redactor who, although all of these different lines and Israelite or Judahite hypotheses for the origins and creation of the nation of Israel conflicted and contradicted with one another, this redactor was a genius and worked them together and made one seamless text. Although not really seamless, there are supposedly, according to these critical scholars, flaws and breakthroughs and contradictions still apparent in the text that you can see, and which have allowed them to understand that there are this many amount of authors behind the text, and that they are actually independent sources that were all stitched together and made into one, even though they contradict one another. So, in this video, I want to break that down and kind of deconstruct this documentary hypothesis in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, which is the structural half. So first, let me get into the documentary hypothesis. Now, before people come in criticizing, saying, oh, the documentary hypothesis is falling out of favor. Okay, I understand. But new scholars are coming up with new ideas that are still based on a lot of the same presuppositions and beliefs that these same authors exist, and that a lot of these propagandas and sundry scriptures that were all eventually knit together, they still have similar views about which parts of the scriptures they can attribute to which person and who those people or schools even are. So I am getting my version of this hypothesis and the explanation of these sources from this wonderful critical edition of the Old Testament that I'm reading right now, the Norton Critical Edition of the English Bible, or the King James Version, and it's edited by Herbert Marks. So, from his explanation, I'm going to explain the documentary hypothesis, break it down, and then show the extreme inconsistencies all throughout the first 11 chapters of Genesis. So, in this hypothesis, again, I'm going to continue to call it the documentary hypothesis. Please have mercy on me, even though I know that it's falling out of favor and scholars are coming up with new ideas. Nonetheless, this was a theory that I think goes back to the mid-19th century, and it was in German. So some people now think of it as just any theory that has to do with JEDP. And again, remember, this was created in Germany, where there's a lot of biblical scholarship, and so the letters don't necessarily line up to our English pronunciations. But J stands for the Yahwist. Now, the Yahwist wrote together a bunch of his own literature and had his own ideas about the world and God and who he was and what everything works. And the Yahwist was writing around the time of David or Solomon's reign in the 10th century. The Yahwist is called so because, you guessed it, he loves to refer to God by his covenant name, which most people believe is probably Yahweh. And he thinks of God more anthropomorphically. That is, God can be talked about more in terms similar to how humans act. And we'll see examples of this as we go throughout the text and see parts of the Pentateuch that were ascribed to this Yahwist. The Yahwist also has a grim view of humanity. So when you see flaws, fundamental flaws in humans, you see the good guys messing up, things that you won't really find in other ancient literature at the time or the area. Yeah, that's the Yahwist. That's something that he emphasizes more. He also assumes a more conditional covenant, and that the blessings promised to Israel were more based on how they acted and kept faithful to God's covenant. Then there is the Elohist. This dates to the mid-8th century. God is referred to not by his name, Yahweh, but simply with the title Elohim, which translates to God, sometimes gods. That's a complicated thing. That's an aside. That is a title, by the way. That's not a name. God is not a name. This follows more the patriarchs as Israel's founders rather than Moses. So rather than seeing Moses as the originator, this Elohist didn't necessarily know that Moses even existed. He knew more Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it's more the promises that God made to them. And, he doesn't necessarily have Moses in the mix of his understanding of the history. So according to some, this Yahwist and Elohist, these sources that were written by different people or schools of thought were combined following the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in the mid-7th century. Or, according to other people, the earliest traditions began to be assembled together because of the promotion of writing under the reign of King Hezekiah in the 8th century. So King Hezekiah pretty much was doing a lot, pushing for literacy and writing down early things. We see in Proverbs, there's a verse in Proverbs that talks about different things that Hezekiah compiled. And so some scholars think that Hezekiah really started to push for writing down more of Israel's earlier traditions. And so they started to compile some of these together. And some newer theories will actually put the Yahwist and the Elohist together and say those aren't necessarily two different sources. They'll say that there was this lay source, according to Herbert Marx. So they believe God to be more personal, again, just like the Yahwist sees him as more anthropomorphic. He's inclusivist. You'll see that Abraham, remember, the Elohist is emphasizing more the patriarchs than Moses. So you'll have times where Abraham is with the Hittites and he's trying to buy some land so he can bury Sarah, his wife, who's dead, in the cave of Machpelah. You'll see that he's chilling with the Amorites. He's chilling with all the native Canaanites. So they're like, yeah, sure, we can live together. Canaanites and Israelites in the promised land, we can do it. They, again, assume that the covenant is conditional. Just like the Yahwist, they see the promised land as a blessing given by God to the patriarchs that's to be taken gradually, but also peacefully, because remember, they're inclusivist. So it's not as much what we'll see with other authors, according to this hypothesis, that says that God is saying that these people in the land of Canaan have sinned to the fullest extent, and they need to be exterminated, and there needs to be a flood that's going to wash it and cleanse it and make it clean again. So this lay writer, which is combination of the Yahwist and the Elohist in some theories, they use more narrative suspense. There's more gaps in the narrative and there's more ambiguities. So again, that's according to some newer theories about the Yahwist and the Elohist being together. The original just had the Yahwist and the Elohist. And then there's the Deuteronomist. Now with the Yahwist and the Elohist, again, those are kind of similar, and scholars are trying to see those as more or less the same or combined early on and not as conflicting. The Deuteronomist, you'll see, as you could have assumed, is the vast majority of the book of Deuteronomy, and that's mostly what the Deuteronomist wrote. And again, for the documentary hypothesis, even though there's pretty much consensus that there's some version of the documentary hypothesis or supplementary hypothesis or some other hypothesis springing out of it that's based on these authors or some variation of it, they nonetheless debate about what sources can be attributed to who. Some parts of the Pentateuch or the scriptures are more debated than others. But Deuteronomy is seen as the Deuteronomist. It's not just that, but that's the big part. So he's called the Deuteronomist. He dates to Jeremiah's reign in the mid-6th century. So remember that Jeremiah finds the book of the law of Moses. And when you read that part of the scriptures in Kings, you see that there's all this emphasis on how he found it. And so they're saying that, see, in the book of Kings, they're actually trying to write propaganda that's explaining Jeremiah's finding of this Deuteronomist source, when really this was being written around or composed at least around this time, and they were starting to say that you had to sacrifice in Jerusalem. There was a lot more emphasis on sacrificing in Jerusalem and everything being centered around Jerusalem. This is also exclusivist. So again, in Deuteronomy, there's all these warnings. And again, Deuteronomy isn't the only place that the only part of scripture that the Deuteronomist was contributing to, but especially in Deuteronomy, you see this whole thing about how you shouldn't be like those in the land among you. Like God is sending you into the land, even though you're the least of these. And it's not because you're a great nation. No, it's because of the sins of these people. And so it's exclusivist. You need to wipe out the Canaanites. It demands animal sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem. There are places in Leviticus that talk about if you offer another high high places. This is how you need to do it, and just make sure that you're careful. So they see these as conflicting and contradicting, and the Deuteronomist is saying, no, there's only one place to sacrifice, as it says in Deuteronomy. You must sacrifice everything in Jerusalem. It sees the promised land as being given to Israel by God through divinely commanded wars to destroy the natives whose sins had corrupted it. In other words, the Canaanite conquest is from the Deuteronomist. So you can thank him for that, according to these critical scholars. And the Deuteronomist account is seeking to explain the fall of the southern kingdom of Judah. So why is it that the southern kingdom of Judah was fallen and taken into captivity? Well, you can thank it to the idolatry of these kings who are acting like the Canaanites, offering up their children, passing their children through the fire to Molech, and sacrificing to these pagan gods, and not being faithful to the covenant. And so anyways, according to many scholars, this Deuteronomist source was appended to the JE source, that is the Yahwist and the Elohist, with some of its own additions to the previous source. So not only are they adding this on to the material written by J and E, but they're also adding in a little bit of things. Remember, they didn't just write Deuteronomy. They also included some of their own things. And this is during the reign of the King Josiah in the mid-6th century. Then we also have P, the priestly source. This dates to the early Persian period in the mid-5th century. So this is like when Israel is just coming out of captivity, or Judah rather. So they believe God to be more abstract. He's not as personable. Remember how the Yahwist talks about God more anthropomorphically. This looks to God's election and blessings pronounced on creation for hope for the future. And again, we're going to get into examples of all these as I deconstruct it. This has a dynamic view of holiness. It permits animal sacrifice at local shrines. So remember Leviticus. It's a priestly text, not every Christian's favorite to read, but a lot of that and a lot of Numbers is written by this priestly writer according to the documentary hypothesis. It also understands that the temple cult system is a means for atoning for Israel's sins and granting them forgiveness. It's really emphasizing the need to have things done ritually right. You need to have the right rituals. It focuses on hierarchy, numbers, lists, genealogies, and travel itineraries. So pretty much every Christian's least favorite parts of the Bible to read. So again, following these newer beliefs, there's now also a new person, the Redactor. So this pious Redactor combined the priestly source with the earlier JED source. Or according to some theories, this post-exilic scribes reworked previous compended literature from remains and remembrance, and they reinvented some of the connections in new episodes as appropriate. So pretty much after the exile, these scribes already had some literature, but some of the stuff was missing. And so they kind of made stuff to fill in the gaps, and they made ways to like connect these sources, even though they kind of disagree and are contradictory. Or there's also the theory that the lay and the priestly materials were put together by some scribe, pressured by both the priests and the wealthy land-owning lay elders in the early Persian period. Remember how I talked about the lay source? Now, that's not like an official title or anything, but Mark Herberts, in this Norton Critical edition of the English Bible, talks about how in Ezra, there's these lay people that come to Ezra, and there's these priests that come to Ezra. And so he sees this as kind of evidence for the J and E people and the P people coming and pressuring him. And because of the pressure, this Redactor is like, oh my gosh, these theologies, these anthropologies, these views of humanity and the world and the cosmos and creation and everything, they contradict, but there's this pressure. And, I want to unite these people. And so I guess I'll compromise and put them together, even though they contradict, and we'll have beautiful, genius literature. So here we have it. Beautiful, genius literature that just does not make sense if it is, as these critical scholars suppose, sundry scriptures that all disagree, contradict, conflict, but nonetheless, we're all knit together as one coherent whole. Well, they would say semi-coherent. So, with that being said, let's jump right into it. And we're just going to go through these sources. And this is mostly J and P. And again, scholars debate about what sources should be attributed to what. I'm following Herbert Marks and what he says. And some of this is more set in stone than others. But we're just going to rip this thing to shreds. So let's get into it. First, we're going to start with the priestly author, because the priestly author was the first person to write the first words of the Torah. Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 is apparently attributed to this priestly author who wrote the 7-day creation account. Now, unfortunately, our chapters and verse divisions for the Bible are errant, are fallible. And so, of course, they had to cut off the 7-day creation account with chapter 2 beginning with the 7th day of that creation account. Now, I don't subscribe to this. I'm in fact deconstructing it in this video, but the 7-day creation account is obviously one literary unit. So that chaptering sequence, all scholars, Christian and not, fundamentalist and not, we know that it's bogus. But nonetheless, they believe that he wrote Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. So the interesting thing, there are quite a few different parts of this that don't seem to have as priestly emphases as you might think. So the arguments for this being priestly is that there's all this emphasis on creation and ordering and separating. So in Leviticus, there's a difference between clean and unclean things. And these aren't moral, they aren't ethical, none of that. These are simply distinctions between what symbolizes death and what symbolizes life and purity. And you can't mix those two together. And so because the 7-day creation account is also obsessed with talking about God splitting, remember, God divides the day from the night, God divides the waters from the waters, God divides the dry land from the waters, and then God creates all these animals according to their kind. And again, remember in Leviticus, which is also priestly literature, you have all these rules about these different kinds of animals that you can eat and these different kinds of animals that you can't eat. And in Genesis 1, there's also this hierarchy. So everything is built up until the very good, which is the creation of humanity. So there's this ordering, there's this hierarchy. There's also the fact that God makes the world in 7 days and he rests on the 7th day. And that has to do with providing a reason for why humans should rest on the Sabbath, which is a ritual. So of course this is written by the priestly author. Except that there are also parts of this that, go figure, actually have emphases found from other supposed authors according to this documentary hypothesis. So you have a form of God's name used, Yahweh, to talk about God's first act of creating light. So Yahweh means he will be, and God says, let there be light. And actually, I learned this from Herbert Marx. I've read quite a bit of literature on Genesis, and especially Genesis 1. And he was the person that I learned this from. So it's not a big gotcha moment, but it's pretty interesting that this author is using God's divine name to talk about him creating light. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see that light is attributed to those who are good. They're called the sons of light. John, in his retelling of the creation account, says that he connects the word to being God because God creates with his word. And then he attributes the word to light. He is the light, and the light is the light of man, and it shines in the darkness, and the darkness can't overcome it. Just like the divine title, a form of the divine title that's used in the very first sentence. Yeah, the first couple verses are all one sentence, but that's a little bit more complicated. So, anyways, that's pretty interesting. Another interesting thing is that God establishes humans not in a more priestly sense, like we'll see in the supposed J creation account, but as kings, royal kings. In this priestly creation account, he's establishing humans as kings. Why is he so concerned about them being kings in this priestly creation account, unless priestly and royal ideas were mixed together, and it's almost like there was one author for the Pentateuch, and even though it was redacted over time, this author had multiple different nuanced beliefs that all cohered and went together. And so there's more of a focus on God establishing humans as his royal representative images, not priests. That's what the image of God is about. This isn't this whole philosophical thing about whether humans can think or not, whether they have spirits or souls or not. You can get into that debate in systematic theology, but when you're comparing this to ancient Near Eastern literature at its time and you're reading it in its original context, this is referring to kings. And so it's interesting that this supposed priestly author is so obsessed with making humans kings, whereas we'll see that the Yahwist is actually focusing on making them. So Genesis 1:28, God blesses the humans, and then he commands them to subdue the ground as if it were a threat, like the Canaanites. Now, remember, this is a Deuteronomist view, is that they're supposed to go in the land and capture it through holy war and devote things to destruction because of the sin of the Canaanites. Now, this word subdue is a violent word, and it's used to talk about the Canaanites. And this word is used here. God blesses these humans and tells them to subdue the ground. This is obviously linked on to that same idea of God blessing and choosing Israel and telling them to subdue Canaan. So why is the priest so focused on this? Anyways, God then commands the humans to rule over the birds of the sky, the fish in the sea, and the animals on the ground. Again, if you didn't know anything about the image of God, he's specifically using words to talk about, he's using royal vocabulary of ruling and being a king and a queen. He's not using priestly imagery. So to make this point even more clear, we're going to jump over to the J source and see how the J source is actually talking about how humans are supposed to be like priests. So according to the documentary hypothesis, Genesis 2 verse 4 to chapter 4 and all of chapter 4 were written by the Yahwist. So remember, this talks about when there was no shrub in the field, there were no plants, and the land was dry and desolate, and there was a spring that came out from the ground to water the earth, and then God, forms the humans from the dust. So, God is spoken of anthropomorphically here. In the former account, God is more, it just uses God's name, or it just uses the title God, not God's name. But here it says, and Yahweh God, the Lord God, Jehovah, comes and he is getting in the dust with the humans, and he's acting more, he's talked and described as being more like a human, even though they didn't believe that he was a human. So of course, this should be attributed to the Yahwist, except the very first, the opening to this section, ironically opens up saying, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. Now, think about it. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. That is a phrase that's found and used specifically in genealogies. Remember, who's your genealogy guy? The person who writes all of your least favorite parts of the Bible. That would be the priestly author. He's the one who likes to write the genealogies. And there are a total of, I think it was 6 genealogies in Genesis and 7 genealogies in the whole Torah that open up with this same very phrase. So unless the Deuteronomist was writing all of those genealogies, which according to the contemporary scholarly consensus, he didn't, and in fact he didn't write this one, this just doesn't make sense. Why is he so concerned about this being a genealogy? Why isn't he, like the priestly author, talking about God creating the world from darkness and from lack of substance and disorder? Doesn't make sense. So anyways, that being put aside, Yahweh gives the humans the priestly duties of working and keeping the Garden of Eden. Okay, so what, Michael? Well, actually, these words, and there might be different words depending on your translation, but the word work and keep are used together throughout the book of Leviticus. These two words right next to each other, just like they are in verse 15 of chapter 2 of Genesis, to talk about how the priests need to take care of the tabernacle. This is obviously referring to Eden, which is put on the land that has 2 trees in the middle of it, just like the 3 sections of the tabernacle, again, which is priestly. This is obviously showing that Adam is a priest. He's doing priestly work in Eden. Why is this Yahwist so obsessed with this priestly work? So then Yahweh commands the human to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. But before that, he even commands him to eat from the tree of life and all the other trees, which seems pretty similar to Deuteronomy, because remember, in Deuteronomy, the author is presenting before us 2 ways, the way of life and death, the way of blessing and the way of curse. You have to choose for yourself. What are you going to do? That's kind of similar to the Deuteronomist. Then, again, this is not just the creation account, but this is going on all the way until the end of chapter 4, so the end of the Cain and Abel story. So the interesting thing about the Cain and Abel narrative is that the Cain and Abel narrative open up with Cain and Abel just offering sacrifices. It's as if they're trying to sacrifice right in front of the door to Eden, the garden in Eden, and Adam and Eve had only been kicked out of the garden. It didn't say that they were kicked out of Eden. They're sacrificing right in front of the garden, just like how in the tabernacle you give sacrifices in the courtyard before the tent. And not only does it say that they gave sacrifices, sacrifices were assumed as a part of the daily life of, you're just fellow everyday lad in the ancient Near East. But there's a particular emphasis on the type of sacrifice that they give. So Cain is giving a sacrifice of what's of the ground, whereas Abel is giving a sacrifice of cattle and of sheep and of living animals. And God is displeased with Cain's sacrifice, but he's not with Abel's. So why is there this emphasis on ritual? Then you also see that Yahweh exiles Cain for his sin, and he marks him with a promise of protection. Now, this is deep and this is two-layered. There's this emphasis on exile. So there's this exile of Adam from the garden, Adam and Eve, and then Cain even further to the east, so probably out of Eden. And remember that Josiah's source, the Deuteronomist, he's trying to explain the exile of the southern kingdom of Judah and why they were sent out because of their covenant unfaithfulness. Exile, again, is just a prominent theme throughout the Torah and throughout the Tanakh and the Old Testament, but especially this is supposedly a Deuteronomist thing. And so why is there this special emphasis on it in this Yahwist source that is supposedly written around the time of David and Solomon before the exile? That's an interesting thing. You got to, and this isn't just like something that could be added in later because, you know, Cain's line and his exile builds a whole city and that, you know, leads up to even more disaster. Like this is like a key integral part of the story. This couldn't have just been added in later. This is deeply connected with the rest of the Cain and Abel story, and Yahweh's name is still used. And then later, of course, it goes on to give a genealogy of Cain with many names that are similar or almost the same as those following the line of Seth found in Genesis 5. That's supposedly a priestly source. So first of all, again, there's an emphasis on genealogy, just as there was at the beginning of chapter 2. And then second of all, many of these names are duplicates, if not very similar, to those found in Genesis chapter 5, which is the line of Seth, which is supposedly a priestly source. So if this was originally a Yahwist source, why do they have such similar names? Obviously, the author here is trying to compare and contrast the two. So why is it that these conflicting schools of thought and theologies that are totally different had very similar traditions that actually make for pretty beautiful literature when it's put up against each other and put together? I don't know. Gotta explain that. So anyways, then we jump into chapter 5. In chapter 5, verses 1 through 28, and verses 30 through chapter 6, verse 4, is supposedly written by the priestly author. But the interesting thing about this is in verses 22 through 24, you'll remember there's this man named Enoch. And Enoch has this, and I'm going to use the phrase, personal relationship with God. And God is described in anthropomorphic terms as walking with Enoch. Enoch walked with God. Now, think to yourself, who else has walked with God? Oh, yeah, that's right. God went to walk with Adam and Eve in the garden. It says God went to walk so that he could walk with Adam and Eve in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, which, if you remember, that was written by the Yahwist. So this priestly author is apparently connecting Enoch to Adam and Eve that it doesn't even know about. It doesn't even have this idea of walking with God. It doesn't even think of God in anthropomorphic terms. And yet here he is doing the same thing that is supposedly characteristic of the Yahwist, but the priestly writer wrote it, right? Okay, yeah. Doesn't seem to make sense. So chapter 5, verse 29, that is supposedly an addition by the Yahwist of an explanation of Noah. And again, it doesn't really have to do so much with genealogies, so you know we're not going to fight that one as much. And then the opening of Genesis chapter 6, the first 4 verses that talks about the sons of God seeing the daughters of man and coming down and sleeping with them, that's attributed to a priestly source because you have this mix of things that shouldn't be mixed together. Remember, they are very set on order and things being ordered right and clean and unclean, not mixing together. So, you know, you could kind of see that. I don't really have any criticisms for that, even though I obviously disagree with the documentary hypothesis as a whole. However, Genesis 6, 5 through 8 is attributed to the Yahwist. So here, Yahweh talks about how humanity has brought corruption on all the earth, and so they've ruined the earth, and so he's going to put a ruin to them. And so these are explained as two different explanations for the flood. And they would say that there's two different flood accounts. And we'll get into that as we start to get more into the flood narrative. And here, Yahweh says that he's going to destroy all the creatures from the ground. And it uses the divine title. So, that's obviously one good reason to attribute this to Yahweh. But the interesting thing is that Yahweh says he'll destroy all the creatures in the flood in the reverse order that he is said to have created them in the first priestly creation account and not the second. So remember, the priest is the guy who's so concerned with order. And so in the 7-day creation account, God creates first the creatures in the skies and the creatures in the waters, and then he creates the creatures on the land and the creeping and crawling things. It uses the same language, but in reverse order, talking about the creeping and crawling things and the creatures on the land and then the creatures in the sky. Why is it using that same language? It's as if whoever was writing this section of Genesis 6 also wrote Genesis 1 and was trying to get you to connect the two and see an undoing of that 7-day creation account specifically. That just doesn't line up. There's no good explanation for why the Yahwist and not the priestly source. And if the priestly source, why is he using the divine titles Yahweh here? So now we're jumping back and forth because this is all chopped up. And this is like a total pattern for the flood story, according to these contemporary scholars. So, and as we go through this, you will see that there are some differences. There are details in the flood account that make it seem like, okay, it's hard to make sense of these. And I honestly don't know how to make sense of these things, but they don't make sense in the way, they make even less sense in the way that they're explained by the documentary hypothesis. So I just have to deconstruct it. I have to do it. It's my obligation and it's my duty. This is pointed to, and Herbert Marx explains that this is pointed to as one of the go-to places to explain why there must have been multiple sources, sundry scriptures that were all stitched together because they contradict. There's so many supposed contradictions in here, differences, that this must be a multiple source theory. But as you'll see, this is actually riddled with the most problems if the documentary hypothesis is true. Because as you'll see in Genesis 6, 9 through 22, which is attributed to the priestly source, God continues to talk about how he's going to destroy all the creatures. So it seems like, why is God saying that he's going to do this 2 times in a row? And, there's actually a pretty good explanation for that. And that's that all throughout the Bible, you see multiple times repetitions of things for literary purposes all throughout. I mean, there's just multiple examples of that. But the interesting thing about this is that instead of listing the creatures that God's going to destroy in the flood, as he does in the original priestly creation account, remember what I just said about the Yahwist. The Yahwist account of God giving the reason for the flood and explaining what he's going to do, he lists how he's going to destroy the creatures, listing them specifically in the reverse order that they're created in the priestly account of creation. Here, instead, he doesn't list them by that type of animal. And remember, in the Genesis 2 creation account, God doesn't talk about, it's not talked about how God creates all the different types of animals in different days or in different ways. He just brings them all up out of the ground together. So the Yahwist, according to his creation account, would have no conception of these 3 different types of, he would have had 3 different, views of the cosmos. There's the skies, the land, and the seas. But he would not be thinking of creation as something that God did where he created these animals on different days in different areas and was as focused on the order as he was. In the same way, remember that in the Yahwist creation account, God is spoken of more anthropomorphically, like the Yahwist likes to do. And so God breathes into the clay that he's formed the breath of life or the spirit of life. And remember, that's anthropomorphic, but the priestly author does not have an anthropomorphic view of God where God is similar to a human. He has a view that God is more abstract. And so it's interesting that in this priestly part of the flood narrative, verse 17, instead of listing the creatures that God will destroy in the order of the original priestly creation account, God says he will destroy everything that has breath in its nostrils. Now, the word for breath here is the same word as spirit, ruach, what's used in Genesis 2:7, where it says that God breathed his breath of life into the human being. It became a living being. So it's using words specifically from the Yahwist creation account. So this is totally contradictory, and there's no way to make these two run up against each other. It just doesn't make sense. And we'll just see more and more of these contradictions in what is supposedly the part of the documentary hypothesis that is most clearly supports it. So This is all spliced, and you can see this in the document. I'm going to put a link to it in the description to this video, and you'll also be able to find it on my website, michaeljlight.com. But Genesis chapter 7 is all spliced up, just like 6, but even worse. So Genesis 7, 1 through 5, verse 7, verse 10, verse 12, the second half of 16, so 16b through 17, and 22 are all by the Yahwist. And again, God is telling Noah the types of animals that are to be saved. And so one of the arguments that talks about the supposed contradictions between these two conflicting flood accounts is that God first says that there should be 2 of each kind of animals, and then he says there should be 7 of the clean animals that Noah should save. And so why is that? And so I can understand why that causes confusion, but there's even more confusion in the explanation by the documentary hypothesis. So at the beginning of Genesis chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, animals are to be the animals that God says that he's going to save. You remember, he's listed that he's going to destroy all the animals at the different domains. And now he says the animals that are going to be saved, they're going to be listed in the order that they were created. As they were created, male and female, a line that's used in the priestly creation account of humanity. He made that. God made humanity in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And it uses that same language. It lists the animals in the same order as the priestly creation account. And it says that God's going to undo the rest of creation in the same 7 days in which he created them in the first priestly creation account. It's also interesting that this is the creation account this is the flood account that has the narrative showing extra concern for bringing along ritually clean animals to later sacrifice. Because remember, unclean animals aren't bad or evil, they just make you unclean and you can't be in God's presence. Ritually clean animals you need to sacrifice. Now, I will say scholars who subscribe to this documentary hypothesis would argue that this is because it's not until Leviticus that it's explained which animals are clean and which are unclean. Versus here, you have to ask, how does Noah even know what animals are clean and what aren't? But it's interesting in the first place that the Yahwist is even concerned with Noah bringing along extra ritually clean animals. And he's not bringing them along because they're better. He's bringing them along to sacrifice, because that's what ritually clean animals are for. So there's this emphasis on sacrifice and atonement, just like in the priestly account. And in fact, he'll make a sacrifice right after he gets off the ark, which he would need an extra clean animal for. If he didn't have an extra clean animal, if he just had 2 of every type of animal and he instantly sacrifices once he gets off the ark, there's no more of that animal. So we lost that animal forever. You need 2 to mate. Takes 2 to tango. So even though the second Yahwist creation account emphasized Yahweh blowing his breath of life into Adam's nostrils, it is purportedly the priestly flood narrative that has been repeating how God would destroy every creature with breath in its nostrils. Remember that. There's just total inconsistencies with the flood narrative and the creation account narratives, and the flood narratives are most definitely trying to get us to recall all the things from both of these creation account narratives. So remember, 7 is all spliced up. So Genesis chapter 7 verses 6, 11, 13 through the first half of 16, 18 through 21, and 23 through 24 are all priestly. And the interesting thing is, 2 times, once again, although the priestly creation account had listed the animals in the same order after their own kinds as here, it was purportedly the Yahwist who had Yahweh telling Noah to save all the animals of every domain in its own flood narrative. So this is getting all confused here, because first it's the priest who's talking about God making the animals each in their own domains and in their own times and orders of the air and then of the sea and then of the ground. And then, secondly, he's telling the Yahwist that he's going to destroy all the animals in the reverse order of what's crawling on the ground, the land animals, and those of the sky. And now it's flipping back, and those are being attributed to the priestly account again. So there's just all this mumbo-jumbo mixing together that just is really inconsistent. We go on to Genesis chapter 8. Again, this is all mixed together again. The second half of verse 2 through the first half of verse 3, verses 6 through 12 and 20 through 22 are all Yahwist sources. So in verse 20, Noah hasn't left the ark yet, because remember, what's been cut out has already been from the priestly sources. It might be helpful to have the text in front of you. I don't have it in front of me right now, but I took this I took this note as I was reading the text, and I was noticing if you're reading this as one, as if it was written as one story, you cut out the parts that aren't part of this Yahwist account, and you keep this as one and you read it, then it doesn't make sense. Because Noah hasn't left the ark yet, because that is attributed to another author, and yet he's nonetheless instantly interested in offering up a clean beast to make atonement for the sins of humanity on the ark. So that's interesting. So Genesis 8, the first half of verse 2, the second half of verse 3 through 5, and 13 through 19 are all written by the priestly author, supposedly. And then Genesis 9, verses 1 through 17 are also written by the priestly author. The interesting thing is here in this very section, in verses 26 through 27, this is the part where Ham, Noah's son, comes in into Noah's tent, and then he, does the deed that there's a lot of debate about, and whatever he does, Noah curses Canaan, Ham's son, and then blesses Shem. And this is thereby prophesying the conquest of the land of Canaan and giving a reason for why they can enter into the land, which is a Deuteronomist emphasis and not a priestly emphasis. The priestly emphasis is on atonement, making people right so that they can be in God's presence. The Deuteronomist is the person who is fighting for the conquest of Canaan and the reason why the land is theirs, and because of the wickedness of the land. And so that's just contradictory altogether. So there are a couple verses that I skipped over, and I was mostly looking for inconsistencies in these first two accounts, or I guess three: Cain and Abel, the creation narratives, and the flood accounts. Tower of Babel, it's not as easy to find as many themes from any author, one or another, but supposedly chapter 7, 8 through 9, chapter 9, verse 25, those are attributed to the Redactor, according to Herbert Marks, the man. If you're interested, you can see all the rest I did for whatever he mentioned. I took note of and put in to this document for the book of Genesis. And so you can find that there. Again, that's going to be in the description for this video and also on my website. You can always find it there. Overall, there's just a lot of inconsistencies, and I plan on making more. Just the very fact that the scriptures are so interconnected and they have all these internal, beautiful literary genius, where these contemporary critical scholars want to tear them apart, rip them apart, and say, okay, this is attributed to this author, this is attributed to that author. How is it that these two authors that never knew each other, who had conflicting ideologies and ideas about God and humanity and the world, just so happen when they are writing these myths according to them, or their stories or narratives or whatever, when they're cut and pasted together by this absolutely genius redactor, because it ends up being incredibly beautiful, gorgeous, even when you put all these supposedly contradictory narratives together. How is it that they all work out together so well? Like, I can see that there are definitely parts that are hard to understand. Like, okay, at first God says you should bring 2 of every kind, and then God says that you should bring 7 of the clean animals onto the ark. But it's just so interwoven that you just can't take it apart. Even the very narrative where Noah gets off the ark, and then he plants a vineyard, he gets drunk, and then Ham comes in and he sees his father unclothed, which I think is a reference to him actually taking advantage of Noah's drunkenness and nakedness and sleeping with Noah's wife, which is a whole different story. But that is, in one way or another, that has to be connected to the Genesis 2 through 4 creation account, where God tells humanity, don't eat from this forbidden fruit. The humans eat from the fruit. Their eyes are opened and they see that they're naked, just like Noah on top of a hill eats from fruit. He gets drunk. He loses his senses. He becomes naked. After Adam and Eve, one of their sons sins, and then the other blessed son is killed, and then they have another son in place of that son. 3 sons. One is righteous and is killed. One is unrighteous and is cursed and sent off. And then one is chosen to continue the descendants. Again, with Noah, 3 sons. Now, there is a change up, but this is obviously still connected onto it, where Ham sins and is cursed. Or his son is cursed, technically, but his line. Shem is blessed. And then Japheth, that's a whole complicated thing about him dwelling in the tents of Shem, but he's like semi-blessed, not to the same level though. And then there's also a little bit of like a kind of curse there, but that's more complicated. So that story of Noah and all them is tracking onto the Yahwist creation account, even though that story of Ham and all of them is supposedly priestly. So there has to be an explanation of why that just so wonderfully works so well together with that. Overall, the documentary hypothesis doesn't make sense. I hope that you enjoyed my deconstruction of it. Let me know if you find any other inconsistencies or you have any other questions or thoughts about this. I would love to hear what you have to say in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out all my other videos. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, like this video, share it. If you have friends who are doubting about the scriptures and their authority or their integrity, share this video with them. Challenge them if they believe in the documentary hypothesis. Challenge them to show how these actually inconsistent parts of scripture, if they were inconsistent as in they're inconsistent to the documentary hypothesis, ask them to explain how these go together with these different authors. But yeah, it's been a pleasure and I'm excited to be putting out more videos soon. But until next time, thanks for watching and see y'all next time.